Okay, the second video for AP Euro on Wednesday, May 6th, still in realist art. If Cezanne became the inspiration for artists who would completely challenge the traditional three-dimensional picture frame, artists like Pablo Picasso, who said of Cezanne that he was his one and only master, then Vincent van Gogh would influence those 20th century expressionists who sought to put their deepest emotions on canvas. Van Gogh, a native of Holland, had a very brief 10-year career ended by a tragic suicide. Although his early paintings, such as The Potato Eaters, reveal his deep sensitivity to those who were economically struggling, his style changed following a trip to Paris, where he met a number of leading artists through his brother Theo's gallery. In Arles, in the south of France, he painted his most famous works, landscapes of sunflowers or cypress trees, using bright colors and broad brushstrokes to provide them with a deep emotional intensity. Painters such as the Norwegian Edvard Munch, who made The Scream, also sought to reveal the emotions rather than to portray the way things looked on the surface. In Vienna, one of the centers of the avant-garde movement, artists such as Gustav Klimt saw themselves as rejecting the values of mass society and proceeded to find ways to shock their viewers through the vibrant use of color or by showing classical images in strange, unfamiliar ways. So now we're switching over to imperialism. I'm assuming there's going to be some nationalism in here too. In the 1880s, the nations of Europe began an expansion to Africa and Asia that was unprecedented both for its speed and scale. This period of conquest and the establishment of colonies is referred to as a new imperialism. The term is used in part to separate the period from earlier periods of overseas conquest, such as the Spanish conquest of Central and South America, but also to denote the fundamental ways in which life was transformed in those regions that were now under the sway of Europeans. The new imperialism was built on a foundation of technological advances. Breech-loading rifles, which allow the user to fire from a prone position, offered a significant advantage over the muzzle loaders still in use by those Africans who had guns. Even greater firepower was provided by the introduction of rapid-fire weapons such as the Gatling gun. Steamships allowed for rapid transportation across oceans without having to deal with the vagaries of wind power, and smaller steam-driven riverboats allow Europeans to penetrate in the heart of Africa. The construction of the Suez Canal, which finished in 1869, significantly reduced the time it took to go to Asia. One of the most important technological developments for imperialism was the telegraph, which allowed for the exchange of messages between India and London over the course of a day, a dramatic decrease over the 2 years it took at the start of the century. The discovery in 1820 of quinine, a drug made from the bark of a sonoma tree, was an effective treatment of the great scourge of the tropics, malaria. Although technology was vital for new imperialism, it would have made little difference without various motivating factors that stirred Europeans to conquer foreign lands. One important factor was the search for profits that were assumed to be had from imperialism. With the establishment of higher tariff barriers in Europe in the last quarter of the century, nations began to look to colonies as potential free trade zones. Raw materials such as the palm oil that was used as industrial lubricant or precious metals such as gold and silver led individuals to the African heartland. Yet those imperialists who saw colonies as a source of unimaginable wealth were going to be disappointed because many colonies lacked any economic value, or if they did, the extensive investments necessary to make them economically viable never arrived from Europe. The exception to this was India, where the British were able to extract enough wealth from it to justifiably refer to them as a jewel in the crown. Another motivating factor came from the social imperialists, who viewed imperialism as a means of relieving certain domestic social problems, such as overpopulation. This would also prove to be disappointing because, for example, in the case of Italy, those who left the country much preferred to go to the United States rather than to insert an existence in Italian colonies in East Africa. Nationalism also played a major role in empire building. European states believed that the only way they could matter on a global scale would be through establishment of colonies. For France, building an overseas empire was a way of showing it still mattered, even after its horrific defeat by the Prussians in 1870. Religion also served as a motivating factor, and Christian missionaries were actually the first Europeans to penetrate Central Africa. Some skeptics question the actual motivation behind the missionaries, as can be seen in a German political cartoon from the period, which showed an English preacher droning on while behind a curtain, a businessman involves himself in the real business of empire, financially squeezing the Africans. Balanced power politics was perhaps the most significant reason for the acquisition of even profitable pieces of land. Nations wanted colonies so that other nations would not get them. Great Britain, in particular, led by the adventurer Cecil Rhodes, attempted to gain colonial advantage from the Cape of Good Hope to Cairo. In what has become known as a mad scramble for the colonies, Europeans drew new borders that demonstrated their lack of concern for tribal and cultural differences in imperial territories. The Berlin Conference ultimately set up the rules for establishment of colonies organized by Bismarck. Nations had approved that they could establish sufficient authority in a territory to protect existing rights, such as freedom of trade and transit. This set off a mad dash that left every square inch of Africa divided among Europeans, with the exception of Ethiopia, which repelled an Italian invasion in 1896, and the small state of Liberia on the west coast of Africa, which remained independent as a result of a unique historical link to the United States. Social Darwinism and New Imperialism. Social Darwinism was also influenced New Imperialism. There was a genuine belief that the white races were destined to have sovereignty over the inferior peoples of Asia and Africa. Paintings would often show colonists with local children, the implied message being that all Africans were children who would benefit from the guidance of Europeans in the role of parents. Elements of the noblesse oblige, can be found in Rudyard Kipling's famous poem White Man Burden, in which he writes that Europeans have a moral obligation to bind your sons to exile to serve your captive need. The so-called moral imperative behind imperialism was also discussed at the Berlin Conference, ostensibly called to deal with the control of the Congo, where it was stated that one of the goals for the imperialist nations was to care for the improvement of the conditions of the Africans' moral and material well-being, and help in suppressing slavery and especially the slave trade. British dominance over India began to take shape following the withdrawal of the French from the Indian subcontinent as a result of the 7 Years' War. As the 19th century continued, additional formerly independent Indian territories fell under British control, with the last being the Punjab region in 1849, following what the British referred to as the Indian Mutiny or the Sepoy Rebellion of 1857. Colonial control became more centralized, with the establishment of an administrative structure to replace the British East India Company. By 1877, Prime Minister Disraeli went so far as to make Queen Victoria the Empress of India, thus flattering his queen, while perhaps more importantly, issuing a warning to the other European powers on the significance of India for Great Britain. In China, Great Britain was the first European state to practice what is referred to as the informal empire, where a state has significant influence over another nation's economy without actual territorial or political control. After fighting and losing a series of wars with assorted European powers in the second half of the century, China was forced to grant European states sovereign control over a series of treaty ports along the coast in Southeast Asia. Although Thailand was able to maintain its independence, the French seized control of Indochina with its vital rubber plantations. Other nations involved in colonialism in Asia included the Dutch, who controlled Indonesia, and the United States, who seized the Philippines in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War. Japan, which had imitated Britain and Germany in its economic transformation into an industrial power, would also mimic their taste for colonial expansion by seizing control over Korea in 1910 after the Russo-Japanese War. Colonialism could also provide certain benefits for their colonialized nation. Again, the example of India stands out because here the British made actual investments in infrastructure. Irrigation systems, railways, and cities were all byproducts of the British rule. Concepts such as nationalism and political liberty, which were later to be used by colonial people as a tool for their own liberation, were also European exports. It was those Africans and Asians who had most contact with the West, often through study abroad in Europe, who were the most committed nationalists. Colonist violence. Violence was often a part of the colonial enterprise. The German explorer Karl Peters, whom Hitler admired, established a German colony in East Africa, where he was referred to as by the locals of the population by the man with the blood in his hands. The most horrific example of the colonial exploitation was by the Belgians with King Leopold II. And we're going to go ahead and read the key concepts real quick. We're going to take a break there from... This is weird. Okay. Hang on. Just computer difficulties. All right, so we're looking at 7.4 social... Oh, we already got some of that Darwinism. 7.5, we got that. 7.6, imperialism. European nations were driven by economic, political, and cultural motivations in their new imperial ventures in Asia and Africa. European national rivalries and strategic concerns fostered imperial expansion and competition for net colonies. The search for raw materials and markets for manufactured goods, as well as strategic nationalist considerations, drove Europeans to colonize Africa and Asia. Even as European colonies in the Americas broke free politically, if not economically, European imperialists justified overseas expansion and rule by claiming cultural and racial superiority. We'll stop there.